Some people measure success by corner offices and six-figure salaries. Others measure it by Instagram followers and designer handbags. I had learned to measure mine by the number of families who had a roof over their heads tonight because of a phone call I made this morning. But try explaining that to a family who still introduced me as their daughter, who gave up her promising career to work at a charity. 8 years had passed since I walked away from McKinsey's golden handcuffs, and my parents still looked at me with the same mixture of confusion and disappointment they'd worn the day I resigned. My sister Victoria had stopped mentioning my work entirely, preferring to focus on her own success as a social media influencer planning the wedding of her dreams. What none of them knew was that their charity case daughter had quietly become one of the most powerful philanthropists in New England, running a foundation that could buy and sell most of their friends' businesses without blinking. But power is a funny thing. Sometimes the people who have the least of it make the most noise, while those who could change the world with a signature prefer to work in silence. As I prepared to leave my office that Thursday evening, I had no idea that my family's perception of me was about to be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office on the 15th floor of the Prudential Tower, casting long shadows across the quarterly reports spread on my mahogany desk. Below me, Boston Harbor sparkled like scattered diamonds, sailboats dotting the water like tiny white specks. I adjusted my reading glasses and returned my attention to the numbers that told a story most people would never believe. Harmony Foundation had distributed $15 million in grants during the third quarter alone. $15 million to homeless shelters, educational programs, and healthcare clinics across New England. Our total endowment had grown to $425 million, making us one of the largest private foundations in the region. Not bad for a woman my family considered a failure. My phone buzzed against the polished surface of my desk. I glanced at the screen and saw Victoria's name. My younger sister rarely texted me unless she needed something, so I set down my pen and opened the message. "Diana, I need to talk to you about Saturday. Alex's family is particular about appearances. Your usual style looks too poor for the vibe we're going for. Maybe you could skip the ceremony and just come to the reception. The photos are really important to us." I stared at the words, reading them twice to make sure I understood correctly. Victoria wanted me to skip her wedding ceremony because I would look too poor. I leaned back in my chair and felt that familiar ache in my chest. Not a surprise exactly. I'd stopped being surprised by my family's treatment of me years ago. I typed back a simple response. Understood. The word felt hollow as I sent it, but what else was there to say? That I'd been secretly funding her entire engagement period, that the beautiful Vera Wang dress hanging in her closet, the engagement party at the Taj Boston, the bridal shower at the Four Seasons, all of it had been paid for by the woman she considered too embarrassing to include in her wedding photos. My mind drifted back to 2012, graduation day at Harvard Business School. I could still picture my parents' faces as I walked across that stage, their pride radiating from the audience. Mom had cried actual tears of joy. Dad had taken so many photos that his phone ran out of storage. Victoria, then just 21 and fresh out of Emerson College, had posted Instagram stories all day about her successful big sister. Then came the McKinsey offer, $160,000 starting salary plus bonuses. The celebration dinner at Legal Seafoods lasted until midnight. Uncle William kept buying rounds of champagne. Aunt Patricia couldn't stop talking about how I was the first person in our family to work for such a prestigious consulting firm. But that was before 2017, before I made the decision that would change everything. I could still remember the exact moment I decided to leave McKinsey. I'd been working on a cost reduction project for a pharmaceutical company, helping them maximize profits by cutting research into rare disease treatments. The work was lucrative, intellectually challenging, and completely soul-crushing. I was making partner track money living in a beautiful Back Bay apartment, driving a brand new BMW, but lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling of my expensive apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wasting my life. The rare disease patients whose treatments would never see the light of day because of my recommendations haunted me. The homeless veterans I passed on my way to work every morning, the underfunded schools in low-income neighborhoods, the healthcare deserts in rural Massachusetts. There was so much that needed fixing. So I walked into my senior partner's office and resigned, just like that. 5 years of climbing the corporate ladder gone. My family's reaction was exactly what I'd expected: confusion, disappointment, and barely concealed embarrassment. Mom kept asking if I was having some kind of breakdown. Dad wanted to know how I planned to support myself working for a charity. Victoria stopped mentioning me in her social media posts altogether, but I'd never been happier. Building Harmony Foundation from the ground up, securing our first major donors, designing programs that actually helped people, it felt like the first time in my adult life that my work had meaning. The fact that my modest lifestyle choices, my thrift store clothes and aging Honda Civic made my family assume I was struggling financially was just an unfortunate side effect. I glanced at the quarterly report again. $15 million in grants this quarter. 50,000 low-income students receiving educational support, 12 new healthcare clinics opened in underserved communities, 2,000 families housed through our emergency assistance programs. This was what success looked like to me, even if my family couldn't see it. My office was modest compared to the executive suites at McKinsey, but it suited me perfectly. Simple furniture, mostly secondhand, with a few pieces of local art on the walls. The only expensive items were my computer equipment and the coffee machine, both necessary for productivity. The harbor view never got old, though. This afternoon, the late September light was turning everything golden, reminding me that Victoria's wedding was just 2 days away. Her perfect, expensive, meticulously planned wedding that she apparently didn't want me to attend. I picked up my phone and scrolled back through our text conversation. The last message I'd sent before today had been 3 weeks ago, asking if she needed help with any last-minute preparations. She'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Before that, a congratulations text when she announced her engagement 18 months ago. Another emoji response. It hadn't always been like this between us. Growing up, Victoria and I had been close despite our 4-year age difference. I'd helped her with homework, driven her to cheerleading practice, been her confidant through teenage heartbreaks. But somewhere along the way, particularly after I left McKinsey, our relationship had shifted. I became the embarrassing older sister who'd given up a promising career to play with nonprofits. What Victoria didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that I'd been quietly supporting their major life events for years. Dad's surprise 50th birthday party at the country club, Mom's retirement celebration cruise, Victoria's graduation party, the deposit on her Back Bay apartment, the engagement ring that Alexander had supposedly saved up for, but had actually been purchased with a loan I'd quietly arranged through one of my foundation's partner banks. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking to the window. The harbor was busy this afternoon, ferries carrying commuters back to the South Shore, pleasure boats making the most of the warm September weather. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably at her final dress fitting or reviewing seating charts for Saturday's reception. The reception that would cost more than most people made in a year, funded entirely by the sister she'd just told, was too poor to be seen at her wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. But then again, I'd stopped expecting my family to understand my choices a long time ago. Maybe it was better this way. Better to know that whatever affection they showed me was genuine, not motivated by knowledge of my bank account. I slipped my phone into my purse and headed for the elevator. There was still work to do before the weekend grant applications to review, program reports to approve. The important work that nobody in my family bothered to ask about. The work that had quietly changed thousands of lives while they assumed I was barely getting by. The elevator doors closed and I watched the floor numbers descend. In less than 48 hours, Victoria would be walking down the aisle in a dress I'd paid for, at a venue I'd booked surrounded by flowers I'd ordered. And according to her latest text, I'd be watching from the reception, if I was lucky. We'd see about that. I leaned back in my chair, Victoria's text still glowing on my phone screen, and let the memories wash over me like a tide I'd been holding back for years. 8 years of secret generosity. 8 years of watching my family assume the worst about my choices while I quietly made their dreams possible. It started in 2017, just months after I'd founded Harmony Foundation. Victoria had called me sobbing because Alexander had proposed, but she couldn't afford the kind of engagement party his family would expect. She'd seen the Sterling family's social media posts from their son's prep, school friends' celebrations, elaborate affairs at the country club. Professional photographers, designer everything. I can't compete with that, Diana, she'd cried over the phone. His mother already thinks I'm not good enough. If I throw some backyard barbecue, they'll know we don't have money. So I'd quietly arranged for an anonymous family friend to sponsor her engagement party at the Taj Boston. $8,000 for an evening that launched Victoria's relationship with the Sterling family on the right foot. She never questioned where the funding came from, just assumed Dad had somehow pulled strings or that one of Mom's teacher friends had wealthy connections. The pattern continued. Bridal shower at the Four Seasons the following spring. $12,000 for an afternoon of champagne petit four and the kind of elegant ambiance that impressed Caroline Sterling and her Beacon Hill social circle. Victoria had gushed about it for weeks on Instagram, thanking her mysterious family benefactor while tagging luxury brands and gaining followers who admired her sophisticated lifestyle. Then came the Bachelor and Bachelorette trips to Napa Valley. $15,000 total for 2 long weekends of wine tastings, spa treatments, and 5-star accommodations. Victoria's posts from that trip had gone viral in her social circle, establishing her as someone who could pull off the kind of pre-wedding celebrations that belonged in magazines. The dress shopping expedition last fall remained one of my most painful memories. Victoria had mentioned she was going to Vera Wang, and I'd offered to come along. I genuinely wanted to be part of her special moment, to see her try on wedding dresses and maybe have one of those sister bonding experiences you see in movies. "You wouldn't understand the aesthetic I'm going for," she'd said, not even looking up from her phone. "This needs to be sophisticated, Diana. You'd just feel out of place." So I'd driven to the boutique anyway and sat in my Honda Civic outside, watching through the windows as Victoria tried on gowns that cost more than most people's cars. Mom was there crying happy tears. Caroline Sterling was there offering opinions and approval. I sat outside like some kind of stalker, using my phone to quietly approve the $5,000 payment for the dress Victoria ultimately chose. Through the window, I'd watched her spin in front of the mirror, the ivory silk making her look like something out of a fairy tale. For a moment, I'd imagined walking in and surprising her, sharing in her joy. But then I'd seen Caroline Sterling's perfectly styled hair and designer handbag and remembered what Victoria had said. I wouldn't fit their aesthetic. A knock on my office door pulled me from memory. James Rodriguez stepped in, his warm brown eyes showing the kind of concern that made my stomach flutter, even though I tried to keep our relationship strictly professional. As program director and co-founder of Harmony Foundation, James was technically my equal, but he'd always deferred to my vision for the organization. We'd built something beautiful together over the past 8 years, and lately, I'd been wondering if we might build something beautiful together outside of work too. "Diana, the board's asking about the event management expenses," he said, holding a folder that probably contained questions I wasn't ready to answer. "Should I handle the explanation or—" "I'll handle it personally," I said, perhaps too quickly. The last thing I needed was for the foundation's board to start digging into my personal use of the event management account. Technically, everything I'd paid for Victoria could be classified as family events, but the optics weren't great. James gave me that concerned look that suggested he knew more than he was saying, but he nodded and backed toward the door. His hand lingered on the doorframe for a moment, and I wondered what he might say if I told him the truth about my family situation. The rest of the afternoon blurred together in a series of phone calls and emails, but the one that stood out was from Amanda Foster, the wedding coordinator handling Victoria's ceremony and reception. Amanda's voice was crisp and professional, the kind of tone that came from years of managing high-end Boston weddings. "Ms. Blake, everything's confirmed for Saturday. Boston Harbor Hotel ceremony at 4 p.m., Four Seasons reception at 7 p.m., 180 guests. The final total comes to $45,000. "Perfect," I said, as if $45,000 was pocket change. "Charge the foundation's event account as usual." What I didn't mention to Amanda was that my personal account's overdraft protection had recently expired due to a bank policy change. I'd been meaning to update the payment information, but life had gotten busy with quarterly reports and grant applications. It was a small oversight that would prove to be anything but small. After hanging up with Amanda, I sat in my office calculating the full scope of my investment in Victoria's relationship. $8,000 for the engagement party, $12,000 for the bridal shower, $15,000 for the bachelor and bachelorette trips, $5,000 for the dress, and now $45,000 for the wedding itself. $85,000 total to ensure my sister could marry into Boston's old money society without embarrassing herself or the family. $85,000 that could have housed 8 families for a year, or provided health care for 200 low-income patients, or funded after-school programs for 1,000 kids in underserved neighborhoods. But every time I started to regret the spending, I remembered Victoria's face when she'd called about the engagement party, desperate and ashamed of our family's middle-class reality. I remembered how happy she'd been posting photos from her perfect bridal shower, how confident she'd seemed in her $5,000 dress. If my money could give her that happiness, that confidence, that sense of belonging in Alexander's world, wasn't it worth it? The truth was, I could afford it. My modest lifestyle wasn't born of financial necessity, but of personal philosophy. I lived in a studio apartment in Beacon Hill that cost $2,800 a month when I could have easily afforded a penthouse like Victoria's $8,000 Back Bay place that Mom and Dad helped her pay for. I drove a 2018 Honda Civic that was reliable and efficient when I could have had any luxury car on the market. I shopped at thrift stores and consignment shops not because I had to, but because every dollar I didn't spend on designer clothes was a dollar that could go toward helping someone who actually needed it. The contrast between my choices and Victoria's wasn't lost on me. She lived in luxury while working as a social media influencer, her income supplemented by our parents and, unbeknownst to her, by me. I lived modestly while running a foundation worth $425 million, but in my family's eyes, she was the success story, and I was the disappointment who'd thrown away a promising career to play with charities. As the afternoon light began to fade over Boston Harbor, I found myself thinking about Saturday's wedding. In less than 72 hours, Victoria would walk down the aisle in the dress I'd bought, surrounded by flowers I'd ordered in a ceremony I'd funded, to marry a man whose family had no idea that the Blake family's apparent wealth was entirely fictional. And according to her latest text, I'd be watching it all from the reception because my presence at the actual ceremony might ruin her photos. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. While I was sitting in my office contemplating the irony of my situation, Victoria was pacing across the polished hardwood floors of her Back Bay penthouse, her phone propped against a crystal vase as she FaceTimed with Caroline Sterling. The wedding dress hung like an ivory ghost in the background. $5,000 of silk and lace that I'd paid for while sitting outside the boutique like an unwelcome stranger. Darling, I want Saturday to be perfect. Caroline's voice carried that particular tone of Boston old money, each word carefully enunciated and loaded with expectations. The Sterlings have standards, you understand. Family presentation matters enormously in our circles. Of course, Mrs. Sterling. Everything will be flawless, Victoria replied, though her fingers were unconsciously picking at her manicured nails, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. I could picture her forcing that bright smile she'd perfected for social media, the one that never quite reached her eyes when she was stressed. The truth was, Victoria was terrified. She'd built her entire relationship with Alexander on the illusion that our family belonged in his social stratosphere, that we were the kind of people who casually dropped $45,000 on weddings and thought nothing of it. Her Instagram account, with its carefully curated posts of designer clothes and expensive brunches, had grown to 85,000 followers who believed they were watching the lifestyle of a genuinely wealthy young woman. But maintaining that illusion was exhausting, and the cracks were starting to show. Every family gathering was a potential minefield. Every time Alexander's parents asked casual questions about our background, Victoria had to navigate carefully between truth and fiction. And every time they looked at me, with my thrift store clothes and practical car, she held her breath, waiting for them to piece together that the Blake family fortune was entirely imaginary. When Alexander walked through the door at 5:30, his Goldman Sachs suit wrinkled from a long day of managing other people's money, Victoria practically pounced on him with updates about her day. "Baby, I handled the Diana situation," she announced, as if she'd just solved world hunger. I suggested she skip the ceremony part. "It'll be better for everyone." Alexander stopped loosening his tie and stared at her. "Your sister Victoria, that seems harsh. You don't understand." Victoria's voice took on that defensive edge she got whenever someone questioned her decisions. She'd stick out like a sore thumb. "Your parents would notice immediately. You know how they are about appearances." Alexander had only met me a handful of times, usually at family dinners where I kept quiet and let Victoria dominate the conversation. To him, I was probably just the older sister who'd made questionable career choices and didn't dress for success. He had no idea that the quiet woman picking at her salad and asking polite questions about his work was worth more than most of his Goldman Sachs clients. But even with his limited exposure to our family dynamics, Alexander seemed uncomfortable with Victoria's solution. "That's still your sister," he said quietly. "Don't you think excluding her from the ceremony is a little extreme?" Before Victoria could respond, her phone rang. Mom's ringtone filled the apartment, and Victoria grabbed it with visible relief at the interruption. "Victoria, dear, how are the final preparations going?" Margaret's voice was warm with maternal excitement, probably calling from the kitchen of the Brookline house where she and Dad had lived for 20 years. "Everything's perfect, Mom." I asked Diana to skip the ceremony part. "You know, for the photos and everything." Victoria's voice was carefully casual, as if she was discussing flower arrangements instead of excluding her sister from one of the most important moments of her life. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could imagine Mom processing this information while standing next to the refrigerator covered in Victoria's magazine clippings and wedding inspiration photos. Well, Margaret finally said, "You know what's best for your day." That was it. No protest, no defense of her older daughter, no suggestion that maybe family was more important than photos, just quiet acceptance that Victoria's aesthetic concerns trumped everything else. After Mom hung up, Victoria pulled out her iPad and started scrolling through the wedding portfolio she'd assembled over months of planning. She showed Alexander the photos of the Boston Harbor Hotel's cathedral room, with its soaring ceilings and panoramic harbor views. The Four Seasons ballroom where the reception would take place, elegant and sophisticated, the string quartet she'd hired, the $15,000 floral arrangements, the celebrity photographer whose work had been featured in Martha Stewart weddings. "This must have cost a fortune," Alexander said, scrolling through the images. "Good thing your family friend came through with the funding." "That was incredibly generous." Victoria's laugh sounded forced even to my ears. "Yes, so generous. We're really lucky to have such wonderful people in our lives." What Victoria didn't know was that while she was showing off the wedding portfolio I'd paid for, Alexander's father was sitting in his corner office at Sterling Capital, reviewing a very different kind of portfolio. Harrison Sterling III hadn't built a $200 million hedge fund by taking things at face value. And something about the Blake family's sudden ability to fund elaborate celebrations had been bothering him for months. The private investigator's report lay open on Harrison's mahogany desk, pages of financial records and background checks that painted a very clear picture. The Blake family was solidly middle class. Daniel's insurance executive salary was comfortable, but not lavish. Margaret's teacher's pension was modest. Victoria's influencer income was inconsistent at best. Yet somehow, they'd managed to fund 18 months of luxury celebrations that should have been far beyond their means. The payments all traced back to something called Harmony Foundation, LLC, which led to even more questions. What kind of family had access to a foundation's resources? And why was a charitable organization funding wedding expenses? Harrison made a note to have his investigator dig deeper into this Harmony Foundation. Something wasn't adding up, and he intended to find out exactly what the Blake family was hiding before his son married into what might be an elaborate financial deception. Meanwhile, back in the Back Bay penthouse, Victoria was refreshing her Instagram comments for the 100th time that day. Her engagement announcement had received over 10,000 likes. Her dress reveal had gone viral in her social circle, and her wedding countdown posts were generating the kind of engagement that attracted brand partnerships and sponsored content deals. But with great follower counts came great expectations. 85,000 people were expecting Saturday's wedding to be nothing short of perfect. The kind of fairy tale celebration that would generate hundreds of photos, thousands of likes, and cement Victoria's reputation as someone who'd successfully married up in Boston society. The pressure was suffocating, but Victoria had come too far to back down now. She'd built her entire adult identity around this relationship, this wedding, this carefully constructed image of success. Diana showing up in her thrift store dress and sensible shoes would shatter the illusion she'd spent 2 years building. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been perfect for engagement photos, Victoria stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows and tried to calm her racing heart. In less than 36 hours, she'd be walking down the aisle toward the life she'd always dreamed of, as long as nothing went wrong with the payments. By 6:45 that evening, Rachel Kim was still at her desk in the Harmony Foundation office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating stacks of grant applications and financial reports. As my executive assistant and the foundation's operations manager, Rachel had a keen eye for details that others might miss, which is why she immediately noticed the payment decline notification that had been automatically forwarded from my personal banking account to the foundation's administrative system. Rachel frowned at her screen, her black coffee growing cold as she pulled up the payment records. The bank had flagged several large outgoing payments due to expired overdraft protection, something that should have been a routine renewal, but had apparently slipped through the cracks during the recent policy changes at First National. She scrolled through the declined transactions, each one coded as family events in the foundation's expense tracking system. Engagement party $8,000, bridal shower $12,000. Bachelor and bachelorette trips, $15,000. Wedding dress, $5,000. And now, a pending $45,000 charge for something listed simply as Blake Sterling wedding. Rachel had been with me since the foundation's early days, back when we were operating out of a shared workspace in Cambridge with a staff of 3 and big dreams about changing the world. She'd watched me build Harmony Foundation from a startup nonprofit into one of New England's most respected charitable organizations, and she'd never known me to use foundation resources for anything that wasn't directly related to our mission. But she'd also noticed the careful way I deflected questions about my family, the way I worked late on Fridays to avoid talking about weekend plans, the sadness that sometimes flickered across my face when staff members mentioned their siblings. Rachel was smart enough to put the pieces together, even if she'd never said anything directly. Meanwhile, I was sitting at my small dining table in my Beacon Hill studio apartment, surrounded by board meeting materials and grant proposals that needed my review before tomorrow's presentations. The apartment was exactly what you'd expect from someone living on a nonprofit, salary furnished with pieces I'd found at estate sales and secondhand shops. The walls decorated with art from local community centers rather than galleries. But the work spread across my table represented millions of dollars in funding decisions. $8 million in new grants for homeless services across New England, educational programs that would serve thousands of low-income students, healthcare initiatives for rural communities that had been medically underserved for decades. This was the work that got me out of bed every morning, the reason I'd walked away from McKinsey's golden handcuffs 8 years ago. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Want to grab dinner and discuss the Vermont healthcare expansion? There's this new place in the North End that is supposed to have amazing pasta. I found myself smiling as I read his message, that warm flutter in my stomach that I'd been trying to ignore for months. James and I had built something special together at the foundation, a partnership that went beyond professional collaboration into something that felt like genuine understanding. He was one of the few people who truly got why I'd chosen this life, why I measured success in lives changed rather than dollars earned. But tonight wasn't the night for romantic dinners and career planning. I texted back, "Rain check, family wedding prep is taking over my brain." His response was immediate. "Is everything okay? You seem stressed about this wedding." I stared at my phone, wondering how to explain that I was stressed about funding a wedding for a sister who'd just told me I was too poor to attend the ceremony. "Just the usual family drama," I finally replied. "Nothing I can't handle." Across town, in his corner office at Sterling Capital, Harrison Sterling III was having a very different kind of evening. The private investigator's report lay open on his desk, and what he'd read was raising more questions than it answered. The Blake family appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be, a middle-class Boston family with comfortable but not extravagant means. Yet somehow, they'd managed to fund 18 months of luxury celebrations that should have been well beyond their financial reach. The payments all traced back to something called Harmony Foundation, LLC, which had led Harrison down a rabbit hole of corporate filings and charity databases. What he'd discovered was surprising. Harmony Foundation wasn't some small family charity or tax shelter. It was a major New England philanthropic organization with a $425 million endowment, ranked among the top 50 foundations in the region. And according to the foundation's website, it was run by Diana Blake. Harrison stared at Diana's professional headshot on his computer screen, trying to reconcile this accomplished woman with the quiet, modestly dressed sister he'd met at family dinners. The biography was impressive. Harvard MBA, former McKinsey consultant, founder and executive director of one of New England's most respected charitable organizations. This wasn't the profile of someone who shopped at thrift stores because she couldn't afford better. Harrison picked up his phone and called the private investigator. "I need you to dig deeper into Diana Blake's background. Financial records, property ownership, everything you can find that's public record." While Harrison was making his calls, Alexander was in his own apartment doing internet research that would have shocked Victoria if she'd known about it. Something about the Harmony Foundation had been nagging at him since his father mentioned it. So he'd started with a simple Google search that led to increasingly detailed investigation. The foundation's annual reports were public record, filed with the IRS and available online. Alexander's Goldman Sachs training in financial analysis made the numbers jump off the page. This wasn't some small community organization. Harmony Foundation had distributed over $65 million in grants since its founding, supported thousands of families, funded major healthcare and education initiatives across New England. And at the center of it all was Diana Blake, The woman his fiancé had just excluded from their wedding ceremony because she might not look sophisticated enough for the photos. Back at the Harmony Foundation office, Rachel was discovering that the payment declines were more widespread than she'd initially realized. As she dug deeper into the foundation's banking interface, she found that all of the pending vendor payments for Saturday's wedding had been automatically rejected due to account protection issues. The florist, the photographer, the caterer, the venue coordinators, all of them had attempted to process their final payments and been denied, which meant that somewhere in Boston, wedding vendors were probably getting decline notifications and wondering if they should proceed with Saturday's elaborate celebration. Rachel glanced at the clock. It was almost 7 p.m., too late to call most vendors, but early enough that some might still be checking their evening emails and payment confirmations. She had a sinking feeling that tomorrow was going to bring a crisis that Diana wasn't prepared for. Amanda Foster, the wedding coordinator who'd been managing Victoria's celebration with military precision, was indeed checking her emails when the vendor notifications started arriving. First the florist, then the photographer, then the catering manager from the Four Seasons. Each message was professionally worded but carried the same troubling message. Payment declined. Please contact the client to resolve billing issues before the service date. Amanda had been coordinating luxury Boston weddings for 15 years, and she'd seen every possible crisis: runaway grooms, family feuds, weather disasters, vendor bankruptcies. But 48 hours before a $45,000 wedding, having every vendor payment declined simultaneously was a new one. She started making calls, but it was after business hours and most vendor offices had closed for the day. The ones she could reach were polite but firm. No confirmed payment, no services, period. By the time Amanda finished her calls, she realized that Victoria Blake's perfect wedding was on the verge of complete collapse, and she had less than 24 hours to figure out what had gone wrong. The storm was brewing, and none of us saw it coming. I was in the middle of presenting our third quarter results to the Harmony Foundation board when Rachel burst through the conference room door. Her usually composed demeanor cracked with urgency. The 12 board members turned to stare as she approached my chair, her voice low but insistent. Diana Amanda Foster is online too. She says it's a wedding emergency. My heart dropped into my stomach. I'd been dreading this moment since yesterday's text from Victoria, some instinct telling me that excluding me from the ceremony was just the beginning of what could go wrong. I excused myself from the boardroom, leaving behind charts showing our $15 million quarterly distribution and walking quickly to my office. Ms. Blake Amanda's voice was barely controlled panic, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling frantically in the background. We have a disaster on our hands. Every single vendor payment for tomorrow's wedding has been declined. The cathedral, the catering, the photography, the flowers, the string quartet, everything. I sank into my desk chair, my mind immediately jumping to the bank account issues Rachel had mentioned yesterday. What exactly are the vendors saying? They're all reporting the same thing. Payment declined due to insufficient funds or account issues. The florist called this morning threatening to cancel the $15,000 arrangement order. The Four Seasons catering manager says they need confirmation by 5 p.m. today, or they're releasing the ballroom to another event. Diana, we're talking about $45,000 total, and we have less than 6 hours to resolve this, or Victoria's wedding is completely canceled. The solution was obvious and simple. I could transfer the funds from my personal savings account in less than 5 minutes. The bank account protection expiration was a technicality that could be resolved with a phone call. But as I sat there listening to Amanda's increasingly frantic voice, all I could think about was Victoria's text message from yesterday. Your usual style looks too poor for the vibe we're going for. Maybe you could skip the ceremony and just come to the reception. The photos are really important to us. Amanda, let me investigate what happened with the bank and call you back in 30 minutes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 30 minutes, Ms. Blake. I don't think you understand the severity of this situation. If we don't resolve this by 5 p.m. today, there will be no wedding tomorrow. 180 guests, most of whom have already traveled to Boston, will show up to find locked doors and canceled vendors. I understand completely, I replied. Give me 30 minutes. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out at Boston Harbor, where the Friday morning commuter ferries were carrying people to their normal jobs and normal problems. People who probably didn't have sisters who considered them too embarrassing to be seen at family celebrations, even while unknowingly depending on them to fund those same celebrations. Meanwhile, across the city at Goldman Sachs, Alexander was reviewing quarterly earnings reports when his assistant transferred an unexpected call to his direct line. Sterling, this is Amanda Foster from Elegance Events. I'm trying to reach Victoria about some urgent payment issues regarding tomorrow's wedding. Alexander frowned, his financial analyst brain immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. Payment issues. What kind of payment issues? All of the vendor payments have been declined, sir. We need to resolve this immediately or the wedding will have to be canceled. Alexander's blood went cold. That's impossible. The payments were all arranged months ago through Victoria's family connections. Sir, I'm just telling you what the vendors are reporting. Perhaps you could contact Victoria directly. We need this resolved in the next few hours. Alexander hung up and immediately called Victoria, his mind racing through possibilities. Identity theft, banking errors, family financial problems he didn't know about. None of the options were good. Victoria was in her Back Bay apartment, ring light positioned perfectly, as she filmed an Instagram story about her final wedding preparations. She'd spent the morning arranging flat lay photos of her wedding accessories, her engagement ring sparkling against white silk as she talked to her followers about the magic of her special day. Tomorrow is the day I become Mrs. Sterling, she said to her phone camera, her smile bright and practiced. I can't believe this fairy tale is finally happening. Her phone started ringing insistently, Alexander's name flashing on the screen. She considered letting it go to voicemail since she was in the middle of content creation, but something about the repeated calls made her pick up. Victoria, who was paying for our wedding? Alexander's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. What do you mean who was paying? Victoria's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the confusion spreading across her face. Amanda Foster just called me. Every vendor payment has been declined. The whole wedding is about to be canceled unless we come up with $45,000 by 5 o'clock today. Victoria's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto her marble countertop. That's impossible. Everything was arranged. Some family friend was handling all the expenses. What family friend? Victoria Alexander's voice was getting sharper. What family friend has $45,000 to drop on someone else's wedding? Victoria's mind went completely blank. For 18 months, she'd simply assumed that the money was coming from somewhere in her family's network. Dad had connections from his insurance job. Mom had former colleagues who'd done well for themselves. There were always mysterious benefactors at family events who seemed to have unlimited resources. But as she stood there trying to explain it to Alexander, she realized how ridiculous it sounded. What successful professional secretly funded other people's weddings? What family friend quietly paid for engagement parties and bridal showers without ever wanting recognition or thanks? I don't know, she whispered into the phone. I honestly don't know who was paying for everything. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could practically hear his Goldman Sachs-trained brain putting together financial puzzle pieces that didn't add up. Victoria, your family's financial situation doesn't support this level of spending. Your dad's an insurance executive, your mom's a retired teacher. You make maybe $40,000 a year from Instagram. Where did you think $85,000 in wedding expenses was? Coming from Victoria's perfect Instagram setup suddenly looked ridiculous. The carefully arranged props, the ring light casting artificial warmth over her manufactured lifestyle. Her 85,000 followers expected perfection, expected fairy tale endings and luxury celebrations. But the truth was that she'd built her entire online presence on a foundation she'd never bothered to understand. Her phone started buzzing with other calls. Amanda Foster again, her parents, unknown numbers that were probably panicked vendors. The fairy tale was crumbling in real time, and Victoria had no idea how to stop it. Alexander, meanwhile, was having his own moment of clarity. He'd found Diana's Harmony Foundation profile online the night before, had seen the scope of her work and the magnitude of her professional accomplishments. And now his fiancée was telling him she had no idea who was funding their elaborate wedding. The pieces were clicking together in a way that made Alexander deeply uncomfortable with everything he thought he knew about the woman he was supposed to marry tomorrow. In her Back Bay apartment, Victoria was spiraling toward a panic attack as the reality of her situation hit her. No mysterious family friend, no secret benefactor, just a web of assumptions and wishful thinking that was about to destroy the most important day of her life. And somewhere in Boston, Diana Blake was sitting in her foundation office, holding the power to save or destroy her sister's wedding with a single phone call. By noon, Victoria was sitting on her bedroom floor surrounded by crumpled tissues, her phone pressed to her ear as she made increasingly desperate calls to every family member she could think of. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled from running her hands through it, her perfect makeup smeared from crying. "Dad, please tell me you know something about the wedding payments." She pleaded into the phone, her voice raw from hours of panic. Daniel Blake's confusion was evident even through the phone. "Victoria, sweetheart, what are you talking about?" "What payments?" "The vendors." "Dad, $45,000 for tomorrow's wedding. Someone arranged funding months ago through some family friend, but now everything's been declined, and Amanda says the whole thing will be canceled if we don't fix this by 5. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Victoria, where did you think $45,000 was coming from? I make a decent living, but that's more than I bring home in 6 months." Victoria's heart sank further, but someone was paying. "The engagement party, the bridal shower, everything has been covered for almost 2 years. Honey, I thought Alexander's family was handling the expenses." "That's what your mother and I assumed when you started having all those fancy celebrations." After hanging up with her father, Victoria immediately called her mother, hoping for better news. Margaret's response was even more devastating. "Darling, we assumed Alexander's family or some connection through the Sterlings was sponsoring everything. When you started having those elaborate parties, we figured you'd made arrangements through his social circle." Victoria felt like she was drowning. "Mom, you never asked any questions about who was paying for a $12,000 bridal shower." "Well, dear, you seem to have everything handled, and the Sterling family has those kinds of resources. We just assumed." Uncle William was equally mystified. Aunt Patricia had no answers. Every family member Victoria called responded with the same confused questions and growing concern about where she'd thought the money was coming from. Meanwhile, across town at Sterling Capital, Alexander was confronting his father with printouts from his late-night research. The private investigator's report lay spread across Harrison's mahogany desk like evidence in a criminal case. "Dad, you had Diana investigated." Alexander's voice was tight with anger and embarrassment. "She runs a major foundation. Look at this." Harrison barely glanced at the Harmony Foundation materials Alexander had printed. "Son, that's exactly the problem. Someone's been deceptive about financial resources. Your fiancé's family has been living far beyond their means, funding elaborate celebrations with money that doesn't exist." "But it does exist," Alexander shot back. "Diana Blake founded a $425 million foundation. She's not some struggling nonprofit worker. She's one of the most successful philanthropists in New England." Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, processing this information. "If that's true, then why has Victoria been presenting her family as barely scraping by? Why all the secrecy about funding sources?" Before Alexander could answer, his mother, Caroline, arrived for what she'd described as an urgent family meeting. Her Chanel suit was impeccable as always, but her expression was thunderous. "Alexander, darling, if Victoria's been dishonest about her family's financial situation, we need to seriously reconsider our support for this marriage. The Sterling name cannot be associated with financial impropriety or deception." "Mom, it's not financial impropriety. I think Victoria genuinely doesn't know where the money has been coming from." Caroline's eyebrows shot up. "She doesn't know who's been funding her own engagement celebrations, Alexander. That's even worse. That suggests either gross financial irresponsibility or willful ignorance." While the Sterling family was having their crisis meeting, Victoria was facing a different kind of disaster. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with notifications from Instagram, brand partners, and followers who'd been expecting behind-the-scenes wedding content. Her story views were down, her engagement was dropping, and 2 major sponsors had sent emails questioning the authenticity of her luxury lifestyle content. One email was particularly brutal. "Victoria, we've been monitoring social engagement around your wedding content, and there are concerning questions about funding sources in your comments section. Until we can verify the authenticity of your brand partnerships and lifestyle claims, we're suspending our collaboration." Victoria stared at her phone screen, watching her carefully constructed influencer empire crumble in real time. Followers were commenting on her posts, asking pointed questions about wedding costs. Other influencers in her network were subtly distancing themselves. The fairy tale narrative she'd spent 2 years building was falling apart in a matter of hours. From my office at Harmony Foundation, I could see the chaos unfolding through the 8 missed calls from Victoria that I hadn't answered. James knocked on my door around 2:30, his concerned expression telling me he'd noticed my distraction. "Diana, everything okay? You seem completely out of it today." "Family wedding drama," I said, gesturing vaguely at my phone. "Victoria's in crisis mode." James sat down across from my desk, his dark eyes studying my face. "The sister who told you not to come to the ceremony." He paused, then added quietly, "Maybe it's karma." I looked at him sharply. "That's a terrible thing to say. Is it?" James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Diana, you've been funding her lifestyle for years while she treats you like an embarrassment. You're one of the most accomplished women in Boston, and she told you you'd ruin her wedding photos. Maybe it's time she learned some consequences." I wanted to argue with him, but the truth was that a part of me was thinking the same thing. How many times could I bail out someone who clearly had no respect for me or my choices? How many times could I watch Victoria build her life on my generosity while simultaneously being ashamed of my existence? My phone buzzed, with another call from Victoria. Then another. By 4:15, she'd called 12 times, each voicemail more desperate than the last. "Diana, please call me back. Something terrible has happened with the wedding payments. Diana, I know you're busy, but this is an emergency, please. Diana, I'm begging you. Everything's falling apart and I don't know what to do." At 4:30, exactly 30 minutes before Amanda Foster's deadline, Victoria called one final time. This time her voice was barely recognizable through her sobs. "Diana, please pick up. I know you probably hate me right now, but I need help. The wedding is going to be canceled, and I don't understand what's happening. Alexander's family thinks we're frauds, my sponsors are dropping me, and everyone's asking questions I can't answer. Please, Diana. You're the only person I haven't called, and I'm running out of time." I stared at my phone as Victoria's broken voice filled my office. James had left to give me privacy, but I could see him through my glass door, pretending to review grant applications while obviously waiting to see what I would do. The clock on my computer showed 4:32 p.m., 28 minutes until Amanda Foster's deadline, 28 minutes until my sister's perfect wedding either happened or didn't. And for the first time in 8 years, the decision was entirely mine. At 4:32 p.m., I finally answered Victoria's call. Her voice hit me like a physical blow, raw with desperation and tears. "Diana, something terrible has happened. All the wedding payments have been declined. We need $45,000 by 5 p.m., or everything gets canceled. 180 people are coming tomorrow. Alexander's family is furious and asking questions I can't answer. Do you know anyone through your charity work who could help anyone with connections or resources?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out at Boston Harbor, where the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the water. For 8 years, I'd been waiting for this conversation without knowing it. "Victoria, what charity work?" There was a pause, filled only with her ragged breathing. "Your job at that Harmony thing. You know your nonprofit work. What do you think Harmony Foundation does?" "I don't know." Victoria's voice cracked with frustration. "Some community programs or something. Food drives, maybe helping poor people. Diana, I don't have time for this right now. Do you know anyone who could lend us money or not?" The casual dismissal of my life's work stung, but it wasn't surprising. This was exactly how my family had always talked about what I did, as if running one of New England's largest foundations was equivalent to volunteering at a soup kitchen. "Harmony Foundation has $425 million in endowment assets," I said quietly. "We've distributed $65 million in grants over the past 8 years. The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. "That's impossible," Victoria finally whispered. "You live in that tiny apartment, you drive that old car. I drive a reliable car and live in a modest apartment because every dollar I spend on luxury is a dollar that doesn't go to feeding homeless families or providing healthcare to people who can't afford it." "Wait," Victoria's voice was getting smaller, more confused. "You work for them or you work with them or—" "I founded Harmony Foundation, Victoria. I'm the executive director and president of the board." Another long silence. I could picture her in her Back Bay penthouse, surrounded by the expensive lifestyle accessories that I'd unknowingly funded, trying to process information that didn't fit with her understanding of reality. "But your car, your clothes," she said weakly. "You shop at thrift stores, because I choose to, because my personal spending priorities are different from yours." "Diana, are you telling me you're rich?" "I run a foundation that helps people." "Victoria, there's a difference between having access to resources and being wealthy for personal gain. But why didn't you tell us?" The question came out as almost a wail. "When did you ever ask about my work beyond calling it some charity thing?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "When did any of you show interest in what I actually do with my life?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her trying to control her breathing. "You're right. We never asked. We just assumed you were struggling because you lived so modestly." I glanced at my computer clock, 4:58 p.m. The deadline had passed 2 minutes ago. Diana Victoria's voice was getting desperate again. Can the foundation help somehow, like a grant or an emergency fund or something? Victoria, I said carefully. We need to talk about who's been funding your engagement period. What do you mean, the engagement party at the Taj Boston? Who do you think paid for that? Some family friends. Dad arranged it somehow. The bridal shower at the Four Seasons, $12,000. Who paid for that? Victoria was quiet again, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head. The bachelor and bachelorette trips to Napa Valley, $15,000 total. The $5,000 wedding dress from Vera Wang. All those deposits and vendor payments that have been covering your wedding. Expenses for months. Diana Victoria's voice was barely a whisper now. What are you saying? I'm saying that for the past 18 months, every major expense related to your engagement and wedding has been paid for by someone in your family. Someone you've been calling too poor to attend your ceremony. That's impossible. You couldn't have. You work for a nonprofit. I founded a $425 million nonprofit, Victoria. And yes, I've been paying for everything. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Through my office window, I could see the evening commuter ferries heading back to the South Shore, carrying people home to their normal Friday night dinners and weekend plans, people whose sisters didn't exclude them from family celebrations while simultaneously depending on their financial support. You paid for my engagement party, Victoria said slowly, as if testing the words. Yes. My bridal shower. Yes. The trips to Napa. Yes. My dress. Yes. Everything. Everything, I confirmed. Victoria started crying again, but these tears sounded different. Not the panicked sobs of someone facing a canceled wedding, but the broken sounds of someone whose entire understanding of reality was crumbling. Diana, how much money have you spent on me? $40,000 over the past 18 months, plus the $45,000 for tomorrow's wedding that got declined because of a banking technicality. $85,000. Victoria's voice was hollow. You've spent $85,000 on my relationship while I've been treating you like an embarrassment. Well, you told me I was too poor to attend your wedding ceremony, I corrected gently. I could hear her sobbing into the phone, and despite everything, my heart ached for her. This wasn't how I'd wanted the truth to come out. I'd never wanted to hurt her, only to support her happiness. Victoria, I said softly. The vendors are probably starting to pack up their equipment right now. Amanda Foster has called the deadline. What do you want to do? Victoria was still crying when I decided to push deeper into the conversation that would change everything between us. The deadline had passed. Vendors were probably already starting to pack up equipment, but there were truths that needed to be spoken. Victoria, check your vendor receipts when you get off this call. Look for the payment source. Harmony Foundation LLC appears on every single one. You're lying, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. That's impossible. Engagement party at the Taj Boston, $8,000. Bridal shower at the Four Seasons, $12,000. Bachelor and bachelorette trips to Napa Valley, $15,000 total. Your Vera Wang dress, $5,000, plus dozens of smaller expenses. Flowers for your engagement photos. The restaurant for Alexander's parents when they flew in from Connecticut. The wine for your tasting party. $40,000 over 18 months, Victoria. Plus the $45,000 for tomorrow that just got declined. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of papers rustling. She was actually checking, probably pulling up emails and receipts on her laptop. Oh my God, she breathed. It really says Harmony Foundation LLC on everything. Diana, how is this possible? Because for 8 years, I've been building something meaningful while you've assumed I was failing. Because I've been quietly supporting our family's major celebrations while being treated like the embarrassing relative who couldn't afford to belong. But why didn't you tell us? Victoria's voice was breaking again. Why did you let us think you were struggling? Because I wanted to know if my family loved me for who I am, not what I could provide financially. I wanted to see if anyone would ever ask about my work, my life, my choices, without the influence of money clouding their judgment. But the text about the ceremony, Victoria started, then stopped. You told me I wasn't sophisticated enough for Alexander's family. I finished for her. You said my usual style looked too poor for the vibe you were going for. You wanted me to skip your wedding ceremony while I was paying for the entire event. The silence stretched between us, filled only with the sound of Victoria's quiet sobbing. Through my office window, I could see the lights beginning to twinkle across Boston Harbor as evening settled over the city. Meanwhile, across town at Sterling Capitol, Harrison was having his own difficult conversation with Alexander. The private investigator's updated report lay spread across his desk, painting a picture that raised uncomfortable questions about the family his son was about to marry into. Alexander, your fiancée's been living beyond her means using her sister's charitable foundation resources. This raises serious questions about financial integrity and possibly fraudulent representation. Alexander looked up from Diana's foundation profile, his face pale. Dad, I don't think you understand. Diana Blake isn't some con artist. She's one of the most respected philanthropists in New England. Look at these grant distributions, these program outcomes. She's helped thousands of people. That may be true, son, but it doesn't explain why Victoria has been presenting her family as financially struggling while simultaneously funding luxury celebrations through her sister's charity. Either Victoria's been deceiving you about her family's resources, or there's financial impropriety happening at that foundation. Alexander felt sick. His Goldman Sachs training in financial analysis told him his father might be right about the optics. But everything he'd learned about Diana suggested she was exactly the kind of person who would quietly support her family without seeking recognition. What if Victoria genuinely didn't know? Alexander asked quietly. What if Diana's been supporting these events without telling anyone? Harrison leaned back in his chair. Then your fiancé has been living in willful ignorance about where her lifestyle funding comes from. Either way, it reflects poorly on her character and judgment. Back in my office, Victoria was asking the questions I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Diana, what changes if you restore the payments right now? Everything will be different, I swear. I understand now how wrong I've been. Will it be different, Victoria, or will everyone just be more careful about what they say until the next time someone needs financial support? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I could picture her in her expensive apartment, surrounded by the lifestyle that I'd unknowingly funded, finally understanding the true cost of her fairy tale. Diana, you're my sister. I see that now, truly see it. Please don't let my wedding fail because of my stupidity and selfishness. I stared out at the harbor, thinking about all the ways this conversation could end. I could restore the payments and nothing would really change except that my family would be more polite about their dismissal of my choices. Or I could let the wedding collapse and prove a point about consequences and respect. But sitting there listening to Victoria cry, I realized that neither of those options reflected who I wanted to be. I'd built the Harmony Foundation on the principle that helping people was more important than being right, that lifting others up mattered more than proving points. Call Amanda Foster, I said quietly. Tell her the payment authorization has been restored. Really? Victoria's voice was small and hopeful. Yes. But Victoria, this is the last family event I'll fund without acknowledgement. If you want my continued support for future celebrations, then I need to be included in the planning from the beginning. Not as a secret benefactor, but as your sister. Yes, absolutely. Anything you want. I don't want anything except what I've always wanted. To be part of this family instead of just funding it from the shadows. Diana Victoria's voice was thick with tears, but they sounded different now. Grateful instead of desperate. How do I even begin to apologize for treating you this way? You start by calling Amanda and saving your wedding. We can figure out the rest later. I hung up and immediately called my bank to authorize the emergency transfer. That would cover the vendor payments. Within 10 minutes, Amanda Foster's frantic energy had shifted to profound relief as confirmations started arriving from florists, caterers, photographers, and musicians. Victoria's perfect wedding would happen tomorrow, funded by the sister she'd tried to exclude from the ceremony. But for the first time in 8 years, she'd know exactly who was making it possible. And maybe if I was lucky, that knowledge would change everything. Within 30 minutes, my phone buzzed with the confirmations from vendors across Boston. The florist secured the $15,000 arrangements. The Four Seasons confirmed dinner service for 180 guests, and even the string quartet sent a relieved note. But the message that surprised me came from Alexander himself. Diana, I owe you a profound apology. Victoria told me everything. Would you be willing to meet for coffee next week? I'd like to understand your work better and make sure you're properly included in our family going forward. For the first time since this crisis began, someone in Victoria's world seemed genuinely interested in who I was rather than what I could provide. I texted back simply, I'd like that, Alexander. Thank you. James appeared in my doorway with coffee and a concerned expression. So did you save the wedding? I saved the wedding, I confirmed. And how do you feel about that? Like maybe, for the first time in 8 years, my family is going to know exactly who I am and what I've done for them. And maybe that's worth $45,000. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp September weather that made Boston look like a postcard. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue dress I'd chosen for Victoria's wedding. It was elegant but understated, purchased from a consignment shop in Cambridge 3 years ago, but still beautiful. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was getting dressed for a wedding I'd funded but almost wasn't invited to attend. James had offered to pick me up and I'd surprised myself by saying yes. After 8 years of keeping our relationship strictly professional, yesterday's crisis had somehow shifted something between us. When he'd knocked on my apartment door at 1:30, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, I'd felt that familiar flutter in my stomach. "You look beautiful," he'd said simply, offering me his arm as we walked to his car. The Boston Harbor Hotel was bustling with wedding preparation when we arrived. Vendors I'd unknowingly hired were setting up elaborate floral arrangements, the string quartet was tuning their instruments, and Amanda Foster was coordinating everything with military precision. Seeing it all come together, I felt a complex mix of pride and melancholy. This was the fairy tale wedding Victoria had dreamed of, made possible by the sister she'd almost excluded. Victoria was waiting in the hotel lobby when I walked in, her face lighting up with relief and something that looked like genuine happiness. "Diana, I wasn't sure you'd come." "You're my sister," I said, meaning it more than I had in years. Of course I came. She looked stunning in her $5,000 Vera Wang gown, every inch the sophisticated bride she'd always imagined herself to be. But there was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability that hadn't been there during our dress shopping trip when I'd sat outside in my car. Before I could say more, Alexander appeared at my side, his expression serious but warm. "Diana, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" We stepped aside to a quiet corner of the lobby, where Alexander's Goldman Sachs composure gave way to genuine embarrassment. "I owe you an enormous apology. My family had you investigated, and I went along with their suspicions about financial impropriety. I had no idea about your foundation or the scope of your generosity to our family." I studied his face, seeing the sincerity there. "You were protecting yourself and your family's interests." "That's understandable, Alexander." "It's not understandable," he said firmly. "We made assumptions based on appearances and never bothered to learn who you actually are. That's on us, not you." The ceremony itself was everything Victoria had dreamed of. The cathedral room overlooked Boston Harbor, where sailboats dotted the water like white specks against the afternoon sun. The $15,000 floral arrangements transformed the space into something magical, and the string quartet's music floated through the air like a soundtrack to a fairy tale. I sat in the third row with my parents, James beside me, his presence both comforting and exciting. For the first time at a family event, I felt like I belonged rather than like I was being tolerated. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand during the vows, and when I looked at her, she mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you." Dad, who had spent years worrying about my career choices, leaned over during the processional and whispered, "Your foundation work sounds incredible, sweetheart. I'd love to learn more about it." The reception at the Four Seasons was elegant and sophisticated, exactly the kind of celebration that would impress Alexander's old money, Boston family. As dinner service began, Victoria stood up to give a speech, her voice clear and steady. "Most of you know my sister Diana, as the quiet Blake sister," she began, her eyes finding mine across the crowded ballroom. "What you don't know is that Diana is one of Boston's most respected philanthropists running Harmony Foundation, which has distributed over $65 million to help people across New England." The room grew quiet, guests turning to look at me with interest rather than the polite dismissal I was used to at family events. "And what you also don't know," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger, "is that every beautiful moment of my engagement period was possible because of Diana's love and generosity. The parties, the trips, this wedding, all of it happened because my sister believed in my happiness even when I didn't appreciate her sacrifice." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. This was the acknowledgement I'd never asked for, but had always hoped for. As the evening progressed, Harrison Sterling approached me during the cocktail hour, his expression humble in a way that probably didn't come naturally to a man who'd built a $200 million hedge fund. "Blake, I owe you profound apologies. My investigation into your family was inappropriate and based on unfounded suspicions. Would you consider discussing a partnership between our foundations, I think? We could accomplish remarkable things together." "I'd be honored to explore that possibility," I replied, meaning it. Sometimes the best relationships come from honest acknowledgement of past mistakes. Caroline Sterling was equally gracious, introducing me to her social circle as a fellow philanthropist rather than the embarrassing relative she'd clearly expected me to be. By the end of the evening, I'd collected business cards from 3 major donors and invitations to join 2 charitable boards. When the photographer gathered the family for formal portraits, I wasn't relegated to the back row or asked to step aside for the important shots. Victoria insisted I stand next to her, her arm linked through mine, both of us smiling with genuine affection for what felt like the first time in years. As the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, James and I stood on the hotel's harbor-facing terrace, watching the lights twinkle across the water. "How do you feel?" he asked, his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that felt both natural and thrilling. "Like maybe my family finally sees me," I said, leaning into his warmth. "Like maybe I don't have to choose between being successful and being loved." James turned to face me, his brown eyes serious. "Diana, you never had to choose. You just had to find people worthy of who you really are." As he leaned down to kiss me, I realized that yesterday's crisis had given me something I'd never expected. Not just my family's recognition, but the courage to stop hiding who I was from the people who mattered most. The wedding had been perfect, but this moment felt like the real beginning. As the reception wound down around 10 p.m., James and I were swaying to the string quartet's final song when Victoria approached us, her wedding dress rustling softly against the polished floor of the Four Seasons ballroom. "Diana, could I ask you something?" Her voice was different now, tentative in a way I'd never heard before, of course. "Would you teach me about the foundation I want to help really help? Not just for show or to make myself feel better about how I've treated you, but because I want to understand what you've built." I studied her face, looking for signs of the performative charity interest that wealthy people sometimes developed after attending galas. But what I saw was genuine curiosity and something that looked like shame. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. Victoria's eyes lit up. "I've been thinking about my platform too. Instead of luxury content and sponsored posts for overpriced handbags, maybe I could do social impact stories, show people what foundations like yours actually accomplish." James squeezed my hand, and I could feel his smile even though I wasn't looking at him. "That would be meaningful, Victoria, really meaningful." 6 months later, Victoria was sitting across from me in the Harmony Foundation conference room, her laptop open to Instagram analytics that would have been unimaginable during her luxury influencer days. Her following had grown to 200,000 people, but more importantly, the engagement was deeper and more purposeful. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen with excitement. "The post about our rural healthcare expansion got 50,000 likes and it generated $12,000 in small donations. And we're getting partnership requests from ethical companies who actually align with our mission." The transformation had been remarkable to watch. Victoria had thrown herself into learning about nonprofit work with the same intensity she'd once applied to perfecting her aesthetic. She'd started as a volunteer answering phones and stuffing envelopes, before gradually taking on more responsibility. Now 6 months later, she was our communications director, and her authentic passion for the work showed in every campaign she created. That evening, our family gathered for dinner at Mom and Dad's house in Brookline, the same dining room where Victoria and I had grown up arguing over homework and boy drama. But the conversation around the table was completely different now. "Diana, tell us about the Vermont clinic opening," Mom said, passing the potatoes with genuine interest. The article in the Globe made it sound incredible. Dad leaned forward, his insurance executive brain engaged. "The Herald said you're expanding to 3 new communities this year. How do you manage the logistics of rural healthcare delivery? And our social media campaign for the expansion reached 2 million people last month." Victoria added her pride in the foundation's work evident. "We're seeing donation increases from people who never knew these healthcare deserts existed." Alexander, who had become one of our most dedicated volunteers, jumped in with updates about the financial literacy programs he'd been developing. His Goldman Sachs background had proven invaluable in creating workshops that helped low-income families understand banking, credit, and investment basics. The Sterling family's involvement had exceeded my wildest expectations. Harrison had not only pledged $5 million over 5 years, but had also introduced us to his network of high-net-worth individuals who were looking for meaningful philanthropic opportunities. Caroline had sponsored me for membership in the Boston Women's Foundation Leaders Circle, an exclusive group that coordinated major charitable initiatives across New England. But perhaps the most significant change was the simplest one. My lifestyle remained exactly the same. I still lived in my modest Beacon Hill studio apartment, still drove my 2018 Honda Civic, still shopped at consignment stores and thrift shops. The difference was that my family no longer saw these choices as evidence of failure. They understood that my modest living was a deliberate choice that allowed the foundation to direct more resources toward the people who needed them most. James had officially become both my boyfriend and co-director of the foundation's expansion initiatives. Our professional partnership had evolved naturally into something deeper, built on shared values and genuine respect for each other's work. Having someone who understood why I'd chosen this life, who supported my decisions without trying to change me, felt like a gift I'd never expected to receive. Last week, we'd been in my office reviewing grant applications when Rachel knocked on the door with news that made both of us stop what we were doing. "The Sterling Blake Foundation partnership has been approved," she announced. Barely able to contain her excitement, $10 million in matching grants for New England healthcare expansion over the next 3 years. James and I had looked at each other across my desk, both of us understanding the magnitude of what this meant. $10 million would allow us to open healthcare clinics in every medically underserved community in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Western Massachusetts. We could provide care for thousands of families who currently had to drive hours to see a doctor. That afternoon, as James and I stood at my office window looking out at Boston Harbor, I found myself thinking about how much had changed since that Thursday afternoon when Victoria's text had arrived. 6 months ago, my sister had told me I was too poor for her wedding. This morning, she'd texted asking if I wanted to brainstorm our next foundation campaign together. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's patience, boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that actually matters. Victoria's wedding had been beautiful, but watching my family finally understand my choices was priceless. The foundation continued to grow. Our impact expanded every quarter, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt like I truly belonged in my own family. Not because I was funding their celebrations, but because they finally saw the value in what I'd chosen to build with my life. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever been underestimated? By family members who couldn't see past their own assumptions about success? Share your story in the comments below, and if this resonated with you, subscribe for more real stories about family success and learning to value yourself even when others don't. Sometimes the people who know us longest understand us least, but with patience and boundaries, even the most strained relationships can transform into something beautiful. 2 years later, the Harmony Foundation's annual gala was held at the Boston Harbor Hotel, the same venue where Victoria's wedding had taken place. But this time I was the one being celebrated, standing at the podium in the same ballroom where I'd once watched my sister dance in a dress I'd secretly paid for. I looked out at an audience of Boston's most influential philanthropists, city officials, and healthcare advocates. The foundation had just been awarded the New England Humanitarian Award for our rural healthcare expansion program. Victoria sat in the front row next to James, her engagement ring catching the light as she applauded. She and Alexander had gotten engaged 3 months ago, but this time, every detail had been planned together as a family. No secrets, no anonymous benefactors, just honest conversations about budgets and priorities. Mom and Dad beamed from their table, finally understanding that their quiet daughter had built something extraordinary. Harrison Sterling introduced me as his co-chair of the Sterling Blake Foundation, which had grown into one of the region's most impactful partnerships. As I accepted the award, I caught sight of myself in the ballroom's mirrors. Same modest dress, same simple jewelry, same authentic smile. But everything else had changed. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal who people really are. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, it reveals who they can become. The foundation had helped over 100,000 families, but saving my relationship with my sister remained my most meaningful accomplishment.